Marble floors can make you feel like a stain. That night at the Halston in Chicago, I pushed my cleaning cart along the edge of a charity gala and tried to breathe without drawing attention. My black uniform clung to my belly, 6 months round, and my ankles burned in flats that were never meant for 12-hour shifts. The guests glittered under chandeliers, all satin and sequins and laughter that did not worry about rent. Their perfume hung in the air like a second ceiling, mixing with whiskey, cigar smoke, and the sweet bite of expensive desserts I would never taste. I kept my eyes down, not because I was shy, but because the rules were baked into the job. Do not look. Do not speak. Do not exist. If you forget, someone reminds you with a stare that feels like a paycheck tearing in half. I needed every hour they gave me, and one missed shift and my landlord would lock the door on my life like it was nothing more than a late fee. The baby inside me kicked whenever I moved too fast, and I kept telling myself to hold on a little longer. Just until the next paycheck. Just until I could buy vitamins that did not come from the bargain bin. Ella was why I kept showing up. My daughter was 6, all sharp questions and soft hands, the kind of kid who still believed adults meant what they promised. Grandma Ruth had her tonight because my place was too small and too unstable, and lately, too close to falling apart. When I left that morning, Ella hugged my waist and pressed her ear to my belly, listening like she could hear her little brother thinking. I told her I would be home for bedtime. Even as I said it, I felt the lie trying to form. Near the service hallway, the music softened and the room's glitter faded into practical light. I was reaching for a new trash bag when the air changed. It turned heavy, charged, like the second before lightning. I caught the scent first, cedar and smoke, and then the feeling of being watched, not casually, but with purpose. I looked up and saw him. He stood in the corridor with the ballroom's gold spilling behind him, tall and perfectly dressed, the kind of man who made the hallway feel smaller just by existing in it. His face was sharp in a way that did not invite comfort, and his eyes were dark, steady, and unsettlingly calm. 2 men hovered nearby with the posture of professional protection, hands quiet, attention wide. Nothing about them said guest. Everything about them said perimeter. My first instinct was to vanish. I started to roll my cart backward, careful not to squeak the wheels, careful not to become a problem. But he stopped me with a single low sound, and my body reacted before my pride could. He moved closer without hurry, and I felt heat from him like I was standing near a fire I did not trust. He studied me as if I were a detail that mattered. The gaze dropped to my belly, lingered, then returned to my face, and I hated how exposed I felt. He wanted my name and how far along I was, questions no one in this building had ever asked me kindly. I answered anyway, because survival teaches you when to cooperate. 6 months. The father gone. I did not explain Caleb. I did not explain the empty bed, the pawned ring, the police questions, the way my life cracked open after he disappeared. I only felt the old shame flare in my throat, in the same shame I swallowed every time someone looked at my belly and assumed they knew the whole story. For a beat, the corridor held its breath. His expression barely shifted, but something sharpened behind it, like he had just found a thread and started to pull. Then the gala shattered. A shout ripped through the music. Glass broke. People screamed, and the sound poured into the hallway in a wave. Sharp cracks followed, too clean to be champagne, and my blood turned to ice. Gunshots, distant but real, snapping the world into panic. My hands spasmed. The cart tipped. Cleaning bottles clattered across marble like cheap little explosions. I threw both arms over my belly, curling around my baby as if my body could shield him from a danger I could not even see. The men near him moved fast, and suddenly the corridor was all urgent motion and practiced control. A firm hand caught my arm, guiding me away from the ballroom's glow toward the emergency door at the end of the hall. My mind screamed for my phone, my locker, my daughter's bedtime, my normal life. My feet moved anyway. In that blur, one truth hit harder than the gunshots. Someone else was steering my next step, and I did not know if I was being rescued or taken. The next second, I knew I was about to be moved. Someone caught my elbow and the corridor snapped into motion. The ballroom behind us roared with panic, and the sharp cracks that followed made my teeth rattle. I didn't see anything clearly, only shapes running, a waiter's tray spinning, my own cart tipping and spilling blue cleaner across marble like a bruise. I folded over my belly, whispering a promise to the baby I couldn't protect with money, only with my body while the night decided I belonged to it. The men around Adrian moved with a kind of calm that felt unreal, like they had practiced this in their sleep. One body blocked the hallway, another pushed open the emergency door, and cold November air slammed into my face. The sudden chill made me gasp, and the baby kicked hard, as if protesting the chaos. A hand guided me forward, firm but careful, and I realized nobody was asking what I wanted. I was being carried by people's certainty. Outside, the alley was a slice of darkness between tall buildings, lit by a single security light that made everything look silver and sharp. A black SUV waited with its engine already humming, and the door opened before we reached it. The interior swallowed me in warm leather and the scent of Adrian's cologne, cedar, and smoke. When the door shut, the city's screams turned into a muffled rumor. My heartbeat was the loudest thing left, thudding against my ribs. I sat half sideways because my belly demanded space, palms pressed to it like a shield. Across from me, a man in a suit watched the windows, and another spoke into an earpiece with clipped urgency. Adrian sat close enough that I could feel his heat through my thin uniform. He didn't need to raise his voice. The whole car seemed to orbit him. The driver turned when he shifted, as if his silence was an order. I noticed that. Then I heard a name cut through the low radio hiss and the coded murmurs. Caleb. It wasn't said to me, just dropped in the air like a tool passed between hands, but my skin went cold anyway. For a second I was back in my apartment, staring at the empty closet where his shirts used to hang, reading his note with shaking fingers. Caleb is common, I told myself. My body didn't believe me, not with Adrian beside me. I tried to sit up straighter, to make myself a person again, not cargo. My mind kept reaching back toward the hotel, toward my locker with my phone inside it, toward the spare key I carried for my apartment, toward the schedule on my fridge that said Ella's school play was next week. What would Grandma Ruth think when I didn't show up? What would Ella do if I vanished the way Caleb had? The thought made me taste metal, but another part of me understood the math. If men were shooting in a ballroom of donors, they weren't playing. If Adrian was the target, then anyone near him became a loose thread. He's something to grab and pull until it snapped. I hadn't meant to witness anything, but my presence might be enough. That thought squeezed my lungs. I watched Adrian's profile in the dim light and wondered what he saw when he looked at me. Liability? Leverage? Something else? The SUV rolled away from downtown, tires hissing on wet pavement, and the windows turned the city into a moving painting. I could see people rushing on sidewalks, heads tilted towards sirens, but none of it could touch us in here. That should have felt safe. Instead, it felt sealed. I kept thinking about how life could be rewritten by people with earpieces. Was I being protected, or was I being stored until someone decided what to do with me? Adrian glanced at me once, and I pretended not to notice, because looking back felt like agreeing to something. In the reflection of the glass, his face was all angles and control. Yet I kept remembering the way his eyes had paused on my belly, as if the baby was a fact he was already counting. Relief slipped in, unwanted, because the car was moving away from danger. Suspicion followed, because I wasn't steering and the road belonged to him. We drove until the ringing in my ears faded and the city thinned into quiet. City lights fell behind us, replaced by trees and roads. I watched street lamps vanish one by one. My phone was still at the hotel. Ella was still with Grandma Ruth. I was still in a bleach uniform, sitting in a stranger's fortress. Then headlights caught iron fencing and a gate that opened like it had been expecting us. My stomach dropped. This was his territory. Chicago fell behind us in layers of light, then in scattered sparks, then in nothing. The SUV turned onto a road that felt too smooth, too quiet, as if the pavement itself had money. My breath fogged the window. Trees replaced billboards. The sky pressed low, and the baby rolled inside me like it was searching for the safest place. When the headlights caught iron fencing, my stomach tightened. A gate waited, black and glossy, and it opened without anyone stepping out. I realized we had crossed a line I couldn't see, and there was no map that led back. The tires whispered over a long drive lined with old oaks. Their branches arched above us like ribs, and shadows moved between trunks that might have been men, or might have been my fear. The SUV stopped before a stone house so large it refused the word house. Soft lights outlined columns, steps, and windows that stared back like calm eyes. When the door opened, cold rushed in again. I climbed out awkwardly, one hand on my belly, the other searching for balance. I felt small, brightened by security flashlights, and painfully visible in the uniform I'd worn all day. Adrian stepped out behind me, and everything tightened into order. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over my shoulders, the fabric heavy, warm, and smelling like smoke after rain. The gesture should have been kind, yet it also marked me, like I was something under his protection now. His hand settled at my back, guiding me up the steps. The front doors opened before we reached them. Inside, a foyer glowed with polished wood and quiet power. People appeared from side halls, moving fast but silent, as if sound itself was regulated. I followed, afraid to breathe loudly. A woman waited near the base of a staircase, straight-backed, gray hair pinned tight, eyes sharp as pins. I could tell she ran this house the way a captain runs a ship. Her gaze traveled from my damp hair to my belly to the hotel badge still clipped to my collar. Disapproval sat on her face like a permanent mask. Adrian spoke to her without looking away from me, and she nodded once, tight and controlled. I understood the message even without words. I was not expected, not approved, and not allowed to disrupt the system, not tonight, not ever. Security shifted around us in a pattern I couldn't decode. One man checked the corridor, another watched the windows, a third stayed close enough that I heard his breathing. The staff moved like they had rehearsed silence for years. A tray appeared, then vanished. A phone rang somewhere and stopped after one note. Even the air felt supervised. Adrian's footsteps set the pace, and everyone adjusted to match him. I kept thinking about my own world, where I had to ask permission for an extra roll of paper towels. Here, permission was replaced by expectation, and expectation was law tonight. They led me to a guest room painted a calm blue that felt almost cruel in its serenity. Fresh sheets waited on a bed big enough to swallow my whole apartment. On a side table sat a bowl of fruit, soup kept warm, and water bottles lined like soldiers. Someone had already found maternity clothes in my size. I should have been grateful, and part of me was. Another part of me wanted to scream that my life was not a problem to solve with shopping bags. I heard Dr. Henry Bennett's name mentioned, on his visit already slotted into tomorrow. Adrian stood near the door, watching me the way people watch fragile glass. In the softer light, his face looked less like a headline and more like a man trying to hold a line. He didn't apologize for the speed of any of this. Instead, he let one detail slip. His mother had once been young, pregnant, and invisible too. I felt it in the way his shoulders hardened when he looked at my uniform. He wasn't saving me to feel noble. He was trying to erase a memory that hurt. The connection was thin, but it was real anyway. When he left, the quiet expanded. I ate the soup because my body demanded it, even while my mind kept watch. Footsteps paused outside my door, then moved on. I couldn't tell if it was security or staff. Here, they blended. His coat still warmed my shoulders like a claim I hadn't agreed to. Then I heard a lock engage with a soft click. Not inside my hand. Not my choice. The sound wasn't loud, but it rewrote the room. I sat on the bed and understood that the next conversation would be about names, and I was not ready. By morning, the mansion had settled into a hush that felt staged, like the house itself knew how to hold its breath. Mrs. Whitmore guided me to a smaller room off the library. Not quite an office, not quite a sitting room. One lamp. One chair placed so I had to look up. Adrian stood near the window, hands behind his back, watching the gray light outside as if it could answer questions for him. I kept my fingers laced over my belly, feeling my son shift as though he sensed the tension. My throat was raw from a night without sleep. I told myself I didn't owe anyone my story, but the way the staff moved and the way the doors clicked made it clear I was already part of a story whether I consented or not. Caleb Hart had never looked like trouble. That was the part that still embarrassed me. He was the kind of man who held doors, remembered my coffee order, and laughed at my jokes like they mattered. When he proposed, it wasn't in some shining restaurant. It was in my cramped kitchen with a grocery store bouquet and a ring he swore he'd upgrade later. I said yes anyway because after years of scraping by, being chosen felt like oxygen. 3 months later, the pregnancy test turned positive. Caleb smiled, then grew quiet, like someone had turned down the volume on him. He started taking phone calls in the hallway. He started coming home late with excuses that sounded rehearsed. I told myself it was stress. I told myself love meant patience. Then one morning he was gone, closet half empty, the rent envelope missing from the drawer, and a note that sounded like an apology written by a stranger. The police came 2 days after that. They sat in my living room, stared at my swollen belly, and asked questions that made me feel dirty. They said money had vanished from Caleb's workplace, $327,000, and that his name was on the trail like a fingerprint. I remember that number more clearly than I remember his face. They asked if I knew where he'd gone, if I'd helped, if I'd spent any of it. I had receipts for diner shifts and overdue bills and nothing else. They didn't believe my emptiness. When I finished telling Adrian the basics, I expected judgment. Instead, I felt the air change, the same charged heaviness from the hotel corridor. Adrian's shoulders tightened in a way that looked almost still, but it wasn't calm. It was restraint. His gaze held mine, then flicked to my belly again, and I couldn't tell if he was measuring danger or fate. He moved to the table and set down a folder I hadn't noticed before. No theatrics, no raised voice, just the quiet certainty of someone used to decisions. As he spoke, I understood the meaning before my brain could protect me. Caleb hadn't just stolen from a random company. Caleb had been inside Adrian's world, close enough to touch the wiring, and he had taken that money from Adrian. Cold spread up my arms, my stomach rolled. I gripped the chair so hard my knuckles ached. The baby kicked, sharp and frantic, and I folded forward to shield him, suddenly convinced the room itself was dangerous. I tried to shake my head, to push the words away, but they stuck. Caleb. Adrian. The same night. The same hotel. The same name I'd heard in the SUV. It all snapped together like a trap. I heard myself insisting I hadn't known, because that was the only truth I owned. I had been working double shifts, counting pennies, begging Grandma Ruth to keep Ella on nights I couldn't. If Caleb had held dirty money, it never touched my hands. I searched my memories for any sign I'd missed, any clue that could prove I wasn't stupid, but all I found was trust, and trust felt like a crime in this room. Then Adrian let the second truth drop with the same calm precision. He had known I was connected to Caleb before I ever saw him in that hallway. My application at the Halston had flagged the name. Someone had watched me, not close enough to warn me, but close enough to judge me. The food, the doctor, the locked door, even the moment he noticed me at the gala. None of it was purely accidental. Heat flooded my face, then drained away. I felt exposed down to my bones, like I'd been living under glass without realizing it. Another part of me understood the logic. In his world, uncertainty gets people killed. Still, the violations stung. He had measured my life while I was just trying to keep Ella fed. In that silence, I saw the board I'd been placed on. A missing man, a stolen sum, a boss with enemies, a pregnant housekeeper who happened to be useful. My fear turned sharp, then steady. I thought of Grandma Ruth waking up to missed calls. I thought of Ella asking why Mommy didn't come home. If I stayed quiet, I'd disappear into someone else's plan. So I lifted my chin, pressed a hand to my belly, and decided my next move would be a bargain. I needed my phone. I needed my daughter. And I needed the rules stated out loud. Shock has a way of cooling into purpose when you cannot afford to fall apart. After that room with the lamp and the folder, my body remembered it was pregnant and exhausted. Dr. Henry Bennett arrived before noon, and I watched him the way you watch a stranger handle your future. He checked my pulse, studied my swollen ankles, and let out a careful breath that told me everything. I was underfed, worn down, and running on stress. The pregnancy needed rest, real food, and fewer shocks, or my body would start demanding payment with interest. That should have felt like permission to accept help. Instead, it lit a hard anger in me. Nobody had asked if I wanted help, only decided I needed it. Cameras, locked doors, quiet staff, and my own movements cataloged like notes in a file. Protection without consent felt too close to ownership. I could be grateful for soup and still hate the strings tied to it. I could be scared and still refuse to be managed. So I stopped circling the fear and named what mattered. Ella. My 6-year-old did not care about empires or enemies. She cared that her mom showed up. She cared about bedtime stories and the purple charm on her backpack zipper, her lucky star. In my head, I saw her coloring at Grandma Ruth's table, drawing me with a round belly and a smile that tried too hard. I heard her asking if I was working late again, and my stomach dropped at the thought of my silence turning into the kind of disappearance kids never forgive. When Adrian laid out what he knew about my life, it felt like a second interrogation, only quieter. Late rent. A landlord tired of promises. A stack of warning letters I had stopped opening because paper can only say the same threat so many ways. The truth was, my stability had been a thin thread long before Caleb cut it. I had a few bags of clothes, Ella's drawings in a shoebox, and not much else. I hated that Adrian could list those details with the calm certainty of someone reading a report. What else did he know? How many eyes had been on me while I pushed a mop? How long had I been a dot on his map? He knew the humiliations too. The overdraft that hit each month, the storage locker I'd stopped paying, the way I rotated groceries so Ella never noticed. Hearing it loud made my face burn, but it proved my old life was already sliding. The rage in me wanted to run anyway, to prove I could still choose hardship over control. The mother in me did the math and saw the cliff edge. Pride would not keep Ella safe. Stubbornness would not keep this baby healthy. So I made a bargain that felt like my first real breath in days. I needed a call to Grandma Ruth, right then. I needed to hear that Ella was safe and still laughing. I needed proof my daughter was not crying herself to sleep with questions no one could answer. And I needed boundaries inside this mansion. Which doors would stay locked? What information was being collected? And what decisions were being made in my name? Adrian did not soften into apologies. He moved like a man who turned emotion into logistics. A phone appeared in his hand. Security shifted to give me space while still watching the hallway. Mrs. Whitmore hovered by the door, stern and silent. Minutes later, I held the receiver with shaking fingers and heard Grandma Ruth's tight relief spill through the line. I listened for Ella in the background and nearly collapsed when I caught her bright little voice asking if I was coming home. My answer had to be honest without being dangerous. I told them I was safe. I told Grandma Ruth to keep Ella close and to trust that I was building a plan. When the call ended, my cheeks were wet, but my hands were steady. Adrian watched me like he was measuring the cost of tears, then set the shape of an agreement through action. Meals on a schedule, Dr. Bennett's checkups, security that would stay outside my room, and a path to bring Ella here once the risk beyond these gates was understood. I agreed to stay for now. Not as surrender, but as strategy. I would rest because my son deserved calm. I would eat because Ella needed a mother who could stand. And I would learn the rules of this place so I could rewrite them when the time was right. Somewhere ahead, an ultrasound appointment waited like a checkpoint, and I realized I was choosing to walk toward it with my eyes open. Days blurred at Adrian Knox's estate the way snow blurs streetlights, soft around the edges, unreal in the middle. I woke to breakfast waiting, not scraps, but warm eggs, fruit, and tea that tasted like care. My ankles stopped swelling so much. My skin stopped looking gray. Dr. Bennett's quiet checkups became a rhythm, and I hated how quickly my body started trusting it. Every time I swallowed, I pictured my old kitchen and the empty cabinets, then felt guilty for being relieved here. Until my mind stayed counting exits, listening for footsteps, and reminding me that comfort can bite. Security never left, but they learned to fade. On walks, they kept far enough that I could pretend I was alone, close enough that I could feel their eyes like a winter coat. Someone replaced my worn slippers with soft ones. Someone stocked the bathroom with lotion that smelled like oranges. Mrs. Whitmore didn't smile, yet she made sure the soup arrived on time. I told myself these were logistics, not kindness, because kindness creates debts. And I was terrified of waking one morning and realizing I couldn't survive without this house. Even laughter sounded borrowed, like it belonged away. At night, I called Grandma Ruth under supervision, and I hated the word supervision even when nobody used it. And Ella would talk about spelling tests and how her teacher let them wear pajamas on Fridays. I pressed my hand to my belly and pictured her small palm on my cheek, the way she checked my face for honesty. Guilt sat in my throat like a pill that wouldn't go down. I was safe, but I wasn't home. I kept asking myself what kind of mother builds stability inside another man's gates. Would Ella forgive me if safety cost my voice? The appointment arrived like a deadline. 20 weeks meant the baby was no longer an idea. He was a person with bones and a heartbeat. At 9 in the morning, the SUV carried us into the city, and I watched familiar streets slide past as if they belonged to someone else. Adrian sat beside me, not on his phone, not issuing silent commands, just watching the traffic with a focus that felt almost human. At the clinic, staff moved quickly, eyes respectful, as if his presence rewrote the air. I wondered what he expected to see on that screen today. When I lay back, the paper crinkled under me, and the room smelled faintly of sanitizer. Cold gel touched my skin and I flinched, then forced myself to breathe. The monitor flickered and suddenly my son was there in gray light, curled and stubborn, a tiny spine like a question mark. My eyes burned before I could stop it. I felt awe and fear and grief for the life I thought Caleb and I would have, even though that dream had already died. Adrian leaned closer, so still I could hear his breath change, like he was learning without words. The technician traced measurements, pointing out hands, ribs, the steady thrum that made my whole chest ache. Then the answer came, and it was a boy. The word landed heavy. A son who would grow up asking about the man who ran. A son who might inherit Caleb's eyes and none of his courage. My joy and sorrow braided together until I couldn't separate them. I pressed my palm to the curve of my belly and made a quiet vow. This child would never feel disposable. I would give him truth and safety and love that stayed no matter what. I looked at Adrian, expecting his usual blank control, but his eyes were different. Not softer like a performance, not hungry, not calculating. They held wonder, sharp and startled, as if he had been punched by something pure. His hand hovered near my shoulder, then settled lightly, careful of my space, and I realized he was trying to be gentle on purpose. For the first time, I believed he saw more than a connection to Caleb. He saw a future that could be built, and he looked scared of losing it. That scared me too, because hope makes a target. On the ride back, snow started to fall, flakes catching in the wipers, and the quiet between us felt alive. I almost let myself enjoy it. Then Adrian's phone vibrated, and the air tightened again. He listened, eyes narrowing, and I knew the warmth was about to break. Caleb had been found, hiding under another name, living small, spending fast, running like he always did. He had followed the news from the Halston and believed I was missing, maybe dead. My stomach turned. If he learned I was alive, what would he do? And what would I choose next time? On the ride back from the clinic, my belly still felt slick with cold gel in memory, and my mind kept replaying the flicker of my son's spine on the screen. I wanted to hold on to that tenderness, but the new information turned it bitter. Caleb was alive. Caleb was hiding. Caleb thought I was gone. By the time we reached the estate, my hands were shaking so hard I had to tuck them under my coat. Adrian didn't rush me. He simply brought me into a quiet room with a single lamp and waited until I could breathe without gulping. The way he stood, steady and deliberate, told me this wasn't small news in his world. I understood that he could make outcomes happen without courts or waiting rooms, and that my connection to Caleb made me the only person whose opinion would matter to him right now. The choice landed like a knife placed in my palm. Not the kind meant for cooking, but the kind that decides who bleeds and who walks away. I felt the weight of it in my wrist, in my stomach, in the baby's restless movement. Part of me wanted to grip the blade just to stop the pain. Another part of me knew what happens when hurt becomes cruelty. You cut yourself first, then you stop noticing the blood. I kept seeing Ella's face instead of Caleb's. Her front tooth was still loose, and she had been so proud to show me the gap forming. If she could watch this moment, what would she learn from me? That power is permission. That fear is an excuse. That men who abandon you deserve anything that happens next. Or would she learn that a mother can be furious and still choose a clean line? Revenge tempted me because it promised silence. If Caleb vanished again, maybe the questions would vanish too. Maybe my son would never ask why his father ran, but I knew that kind of silence is only borrowed. It comes back as shame, as secrets, as a story told in whispers. Justice, the kind I grew up believing in, felt slow and slippery, and I didn't trust it to protect my children from people who treated violence like business. Adrian watched my struggle without pressing, but I could feel the room moving around us, phones vibrating, doors opening and closing softly, plans forming. I realized something else then. For weeks I had been contained by his rules. Now his machine was waiting for my values. The imbalance had shifted. I wasn't just the maid he rescued or the witness he managed. I was the mother who would decide what mercy or punishment looked like. What did I want Caleb to understand? Not that I had been saved by a richer man. Not that I had been kept behind gates. I wanted him to understand that I survived because I refused to disappear. That our unborn son kicked and grew despite his absence. That abandonment doesn't erase consequences. It only delays them. I wanted him to look at my life and realize he didn't get to rewrite it by running. Adrian didn't describe details, but I sensed 3 paths laid out in his silence. Hand Caleb to the authorities, keep him hidden until questions were answered, or end the problem in the private way his world prefers. The last path frightened me most, not because I believed I wanted it, but because anger can make anything feel reasonable for a moment. I thought of Grandma Ruth's rough hands smoothing Ella's hair, of the way she taught me that strength is what you do when nobody claps. I asked myself what else Adrian knew, and whether Caleb had help inside this empire waiting to strike when we sleep. So I chose the handle. I chose the part of the knife that lets you hold steady. I decided I needed to see him, to face the truth in a room where he couldn't charm his way out, and where I could walk away on my own feet. I didn't want to scream. I wanted clarity. I wanted my next decision to belong to me. That afternoon, the estate's calm changed shape. Security checked corridors twice. A locked wing opened for a purpose that wasn't comfort. Adrian's people prepared a space with glass and cameras and distance, the kind of distance that keeps you from collapsing into old habits. As I followed the quiet footsteps down the hall, my baby rolled under my ribs, and I wondered what Caleb would do when he saw me alive. I wondered what else he might reveal. I reached the door and paused, knowing the woman I was before would not survive what waited on the other side. That evening, the corridor beneath Adrian's library led to a room that smelled like cold metal and disinfectant. A soft hum lived in the walls, and the ceiling lights were too white, like winter sun on ice. I sat behind a pane of glass that reflected my own face back at me, pale and pregnant, hands braced over my belly. I felt steady only because I had practiced appearing steady. Inside, I was shaking. Every breath sounded huge, and I wondered who was watching us. Through the glass, I saw the next room, bare table, 2 chairs, and a door that opened without ceremony. Caleb Hart walked in, escorted by men in dark suits, but the confidence I remembered did not arrive with him. He was thinner, shoulders slumped, hair grown out in uneven waves, like he had been living from suitcase to suitcase. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. Seeing him should have sparked triumph. Instead, it stirred old love like smoke, then anger, then exhaustion alone. Caleb looked around as if searching for a script, and I realized how often I had written one for him. I had filled silence with excuses and doubt with faith, patching his gaps with my labor. Now, with nobody to charm, he seemed smaller. He rubbed his wrists, avoided the camera corners, and swallowed hard. He still had the same mouth and hands, but the man inside them felt unfamiliar. My palms stayed on my belly, steadying me while my heart kept racing all night. Behind me, Adrian's presence was a quiet weight, close enough that I sensed it without turning. He didn't pull me forward or push me back. He simply waited, and that waiting made the choice mine. The door opened, and the air from the other side felt colder, sharper. I stood, knees trembling, and walked toward the next threshold. Each step felt like tearing a bandage off a wound I had hidden. Once I crossed, denial would be impossible. I breathed in and faced him, steady. I told Caleb I was done carrying his secrets like extra weight. I reminded him how he left before dawn with a note and a swelling belly behind him, leaving Ella to watch me shake. I described the police questions and the way strangers stared at my hand and decided my worth. I stopped asking why. I named what he did. He treated me like a complication he could erase. My voice stayed calm, but my fingers trembled over my belly the whole time anyway. Then I brought up the hotel shooting, the headlines, the way I vanished from my own life overnight. Caleb's face shifted, and I saw he had clung to the easiest version. He assumed I was gone and let that comfort him. He hadn't called my mother because I had none. He hadn't called friends because I barely had any. He didn't fight for the truth. That cut deepest, the relief he wore like armor. Even, he tried to seem sorry, but sorrow is an action. Caleb tried to explain himself without meeting my eyes. I could tell he wanted me to believe it started as panic, that debts were closing in, that one bad bet became many, and stealing felt like survival. He spoke like fear should earn forgiveness. I understood fear. I had lived inside it for years, but fear never forced him to leave me behind. Greed did. Cowardice did. Choice did. I let his reasons pass through me and fall. Understanding is not the same as excusing. Adrian stayed near the wall, a storm held behind a leash, I saying little but making the room feel smaller. Caleb's attention flicked toward him with fear I had never seen before. Under that pressure, Caleb's story cracked. He implied he hadn't moved alone, that someone inside the system knew which doors opened quietly and which alerts could be softened. He didn't name the helper, but the meaning lodged in me like a splinter. If there was an insider, my children were within reach of danger. When it was over, I walked out without drama. My legs felt watery, and my mouth tasted like pennies, but a strange lightness settled in my chest. The knot that had kept tightening since Caleb vanished finally loosened. I had expected to feel victorious. I felt tired instead, the way you feel after finally saying something you practiced in your head for months. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall and breathed until my son stopped kicking. Adrian didn't touch me, yet presence followed. Back in my room, I stared at the ceiling and asked what kind of justice I could live with. Turning Caleb over to the system might protect my conscience, but would it protect Ella? Letting Adrian decide might protect my body, but would it bruise my soul? Mercy felt risky. Punishment felt easy. I pictured Grandma Ruth's stubborn morality, Ella learning right from wrong, my unborn son inheriting my choices. The insider hint kept echoing. Whatever I chose next would shape our safety and humanity. After I left the glass room, my legs felt light, and my chest felt heavy. I expected fireworks inside me, anger turning into victory, but what I had was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm when you realize the roof still stands and you are too tired to celebrate. I washed my hands in the hallway sink until the water ran cold, as if I could rinse Caleb off my skin. When I finally sat on the edge of my bed, my son kicked once, then settled, like he was listening for my decision. Justice used to be a word I trusted, something that lived in courtrooms and paperwork. Now it felt like a slow elevator that might never arrive. Revenge was faster. It whispered that I could make the pain disappear by making Caleb disappear from my story. But I knew that kind of ending would follow me. It would live in my dreams, in the way I held my children too tight, in the way I would start believing fear was a reason to become cruel. And I did not want my heart to harden just because someone else's already had. I pictured Ella at Grandma Ruth's kitchen table, swinging her feet while she colored. I pictured the tiny crease between her brows when she sensed I was hiding something. My daughter was learning who I was by watching what I chose when life pushed me. My unborn son was learning it too, in some quiet way I could not explain, through my breath and my heartbeat. If I chose vengeance, I would be teaching them that power means taking. If I chose only forgiveness, I might be teaching them that betrayal has no cost. I needed a third path. That night, I told Adrian what I wanted, not with pleading, but with a mother's steadiness. Caleb should not be protected from consequences, but he also did not deserve to be turned into a private ghost. And I wanted whatever money remained traced back where it belonged, and I wanted Caleb released afterward, free to carry the weight of what he threw away. Let him wake up every morning knowing his child is alive, knowing his child will grow up without him, knowing the door he slammed is locked by choice now. That kind of punishment lasts longer than a headline. Adrian listened the way he does everything, completely still, as if movement might crack the moment. I could feel disagreement in the tight set of his jaw, in the way his eyes went distant, calculating. But he did not override me. He did not lecture me about how his world works. Instead, he accepted that my values were part of the deal, and the room shifted. For the first time since the Halston, I wasn't being handled. I was being honored, and it scared me almost as much as being controlled. The next morning, I called Grandma Ruth again, and this time my voice did not shake. Ella told me she had saved a seat for me at her school play, like the future was something you could reserve with kindness. I promised I would be there, and I meant it in a new way, with a plan behind the promise. Adrian's staff began arranging simple things: a tutor list for Ella, a pediatrician referral, a room that could hold 2 kids and a mother who finally slept. For a few minutes, I let myself imagine normal. Then a small detail scraped at that calm. At lunch, one of the security men who usually stood by the hallway window wasn't there. The replacement was someone I had never seen, and he kept glancing at his phone like he was waiting for permission. Later, I noticed the side gate latch sitting wrong, not fully seated, as if it had been tested and reset. Mrs. Whitmore's hands paused on a tray, just a fraction too long, and her eyes flicked toward the driveway before she forced her face blank again. My stomach tightened. Mercy was supposed to feel like an ending, but it started to feel like a door left ajar. I thought about Caleb's slip, about someone inside who knew the right buttons to press and the right silence to buy. If an insider existed, they were still breathing the same air as my children. I stood at my window that night, watching the trees sway under a hard wind, and I understood that my choice hadn't removed danger. It had simply changed its shape. Somewhere in this quiet estate, something was wrong, and my instincts were waking up again, and I asked myself whether Mercy had made us safer, or just easier to approach, and whether the next knock would come from outside or within tonight. Late that night, the house was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the kind that breathes, but staged quiet, like someone had pressed mute. Ella had finally fallen asleep in the guest room beside mine, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Grandma Ruth sat in the armchair with a book she wasn't reading, the lamp turning her silver hair into a halo she didn't ask for. I told myself the security team had it handled. I told myself my nerves were just pregnancy hormones. Then the wrong note hit. A soft chime sounded from the hallway panel at the end of the corridor, the one that usually blinked once when guards checked in. Tonight it blinked twice, paused, and went dark. No footsteps followed, no radio murmur. My chest tightened so fast I tasted copper. I stood, listening. The estate had a rhythm I'd learned: shift change at midnight, a slow patrol pass, the distant click of a door, then silence again. This silence was different. It was waiting. I tried to talk myself down, maybe a battery, maybe a glitch. But my hands were already cold, and my eyes kept landing on the door as if it might open on its own. Motherhood snapped me into motion. I crossed to Ella's bed and brushed hair from her forehead. Her lashes fluttered, trusting. I shook Grandma Ruth's shoulder gently, then pressed a finger to my lips. She didn't need explanation. Her gaze sharpened like she'd spent her life smelling trouble on the wind. We moved down the hall in socks, my palm flat on my belly, my other hand on Ella's small back as she stumbled awake. The safe room wasn't a bunker. It looked like an ordinary sitting room until the second lock engaged, and the air inside felt sealed. I guided Ella onto the couch, wrapped a blanket around her, and felt my baby roll as if bracing too. My fingers found the panic button beside the shelf. I pressed it once, hard. The house answered immediately. A low tone pulsed through the walls, Lights in the corridor shifted to a cooler white, and footsteps multiplied like rain on a roof. Somewhere below, a door slammed. Somewhere closer, someone ran. Ella's eyes went wide. Grandma Ruth pulled her close, whispering comfort I couldn't hear over my own heartbeat. I needed Adrian. He had been in his study, the West Wing. Reviewing reports like danger was just another line item. I couldn't reach him with a phone from inside the sealed room, but the intercom light flickered. I spoke into it, voice shaking but clear, telling whoever heard me that the hallway check-in failed and Adrian needed to be moved now. Seconds stretched. Then the intercom clicked again, and I knew the message had traveled. The next sounds came fast. A hurried cluster of boots, a muffled command, the scrape of furniture, then a sudden stillness that felt like someone had slammed their hand over the estate's mouth. My stomach dropped. I imagined Adrian stepping into a doorway at the exact wrong moment, imagined the cost of my hesitation, and forced myself to keep breathing so Ella wouldn't see me break. When the all-clear finally arrived, it didn't come with celebration. It came with the softest knock, the kind that asked permission. A familiar guard opened the inner lock and nodded, sweat shining at his temple. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. The crisis had been contained somewhere out of sight. Adrian appeared minutes later, his face carved from restraint. His suit jacket was gone. His hands trembled once before he forced them still. He looked at Ella, then at Grandma Ruth, then at me, and something in his eyes shifted from anger to fear. Only later did I learn the truth in fragments. Someone trusted had disabled a layer of access, just enough to let an outsider get close, just enough to test the house. Caleb hadn't run alone. The help he'd hinted at was real, and it had been breathing inside Adrian's circle. Adrian stood with his back to the window, staring at the dark trees. I could feel his decision forming, heavy and final. The darker side of his empire was a magnet, and we were now the metal it pulled. Like if he wanted a family, he would have to change the thing that kept summoning danger. The house settled again, but it wasn't the same quiet. It was the quiet after nearly losing everything. I held Ella until her breathing slowed. Grandma Ruth's hand rested on my shoulder like a blessing and a warning. In the doorway, Adrian watched us like a man seeing his future and realizing it could be taken. And I understood instincts had saved us, but staying would demand more than courage. After the alarms died, the house sounded louder than before. Every floorboard creak felt like a question. I tucked Ella into the guest bed beside mine, smoothing her hair until her breathing evened out. Grandma Ruth sat upright in the chair, hands folded, eyes open, pretending she was only tired. I kept my voice gentle, but my fingers shook when I poured water. Fear lingered in corners, thin as dust, and I could not sweep it away. I kept listening for the next wrong note. In that silence, I understood how safety can vanish, and how kids feel it first. Adrian moved through the hallway like he was holding himself together with sheer will. He checked doors, spoke to security in low tones I could not make out, and returned to us with his jaw set. When his eyes landed on Ella, something broke behind them, then locked back into place. I had seen him calm in danger, but this was different. This was a man realizing the danger had a name, a face, and a bedtime routine. He stood near me without touching, giving me space while staying close. His restraint kept his rage from spilling into our rooms. In the days after, he asked in quiet ways. A second mug appeared at breakfast, I placed beside mine as if we belonged at the same table. A soft blanket weighted on my shoulders whenever I sat near the windows. He had a habit of pausing at my door, eyes searching my face, then leaving as if he was giving me one more chance to choose. I kept answering with tomorrow in my head, because tomorrow felt safer than forever. Depending on anyone still tasted like the note Caleb left. Still he stayed, and my excuses began to sound thin finally. Just before sunrise 2 mornings later, pain gripped low in my belly, sharp enough to steal breath. I froze, counting seconds the way Dr. Bennett had taught me, and panic flooded anyway. Adrian was there instantly, lifting my elbow, steadying my weight, eyes wide with a fear he tried to hide. The drive to the clinic blurred into headlights and my own prayers. Dr. Bennett checked me, and then shook his head with calm certainty. He made it clear it was not labor yet, only practice. The words soon made my stomach drop, because choices had deadlines, and my heart understood. Back at the estate, I watched Adrian kneel to show Ella how to tighten the strap on her rabbit's backpack. He didn't demand her trust. He earned it with small, repeatable care. Grandma Ruth observed him like a jury, and he met her gaze without flinching. I realized my fear of dependence was shaping my life more than my love was. I could keep living inside maybes, or I could choose stability and still keep my voice. Marriage, to me, would only mean anything if it stayed a choice. So when Adrian asked again with his eyes, I stopped running. I didn't say it like a movie scene. I said it like a confession. Voice low, hands on my belly, heart bruised but open. Yes meant I trusted him to be present, not perfect. It meant I believed my children deserved a home where alarms were rare and laughter was real. Adrian's shoulders loosened as if he'd been carrying stone. He didn't celebrate. He breathed, like a man coming up from underwater. In that breath I felt chosen, but also responsible, because forever is built one ordinary day at a time. I was scared, but I finally let hope stay. Later, Adrian placed a slim folder on the table, not as a demand, but as an offer. Inside were papers that spoke a language I understood without reading. Commitment. He wanted to adopt my son after he was born, to put his name beside mine, to protect him in every way that mattered. Then I saw a second set, meant for Ella. Step adoption if I wanted it, her future secured by choice. My throat closed. Tears came fast. Nobody had ever tried to claim all of us, not just the parts that were convenient. I nodded, and everything felt possible. That night, Ella slept with her rabbit tucked under her arm, safe behind walls that now had my consent. Grandma Ruth finally dozed in the chair, still stubborn, but softer at the edges. I sat at the desk with the folder closed, my hand resting on my belly, feeling my son turn as if he approved. Adrian stood in the doorway, quiet, watching like he didn't trust peace yet. The future was being written in ink and in habit. I knew the past still existed, but I refused to let it steer us. Tomorrow would come, and we would build. Snow started falling before dawn, the soft kind that makes the world look forgiven. I woke to a tightness that did not feel like the false scare. And for one wild minute I tried to pretend it was nothing. Then another wave came, steady and certain, and I knew our son had decided his own schedule. Adrian was beside me before I fully sat up. He did not panic out loud, but his hands shook when he helped me into my coat. On the drive, the estate lights disappeared behind us, and the city came forward like a challenge. I watched snow gather on the windshield and focused on breathing, on staying present, on not letting fear steal the moment I had waited for. At the clinic, everything moved fast and calm. Dr. Bennett's familiar steadiness anchored me. I will not describe the hard parts, only the feeling of being held by competence and care. Adrian stayed close, not crowding, just there, like a promise that did not need words. When the final push of effort passed and the room quieted, relief flooded me so completely I laughed and cried at the same time. They placed my baby in my arms, warm and real, and I stared at his tiny face as if it could explain how my life had turned so sharply. Adrian hovered like he was afraid to breathe wrong. When he finally took our son, his shoulders softened, and awe erased the hardness the world had carved into him. I saw a powerful man become a careful father by choice, and it made my heart ache in the best way. Back at the estate, Ella met her brother with the seriousness of a little guardian. She stood on tiptoe, watched his fingers curl, then relaxed into a grin that made the whole house feel lighter. Adrian learned her rhythms too. The extra story at bedtime, the cup of water she always forgot, the way she needed a hand on her shoulder in crowded rooms. Our Grandma Ruth stayed cautious, but I noticed her watching him when she thought no one saw. She didn't give praise easily, yet she stopped bracing for disappointment. Weeks turned into months. Papers were signed quietly, without ceremony, because the real ceremony was daily life. Adrian kept his word about making our future safer. He cut ties that brought danger, leaned harder into legitimate work, and made decisions that looked boring on paper and brave in practice. The estate felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Security still existed, but it no longer felt like a cage. Some nights I woke expecting alarms, then remembered the only sound was a baby sighing and Ella turning in her sleep. I stopped measuring my worth by survival. I started measuring it by peace. I learned that love is not intensity or fear. Love is showing up, and again, protecting without erasing someone's voice, and letting a family be built on choice. I still think about the Halston sometimes, the marble, the noise, the moment my cart tipped and my life cracked open. The difference now is that I no longer feel invisible. Adrian made space for my boundaries, and I learned to speak them. He held midnight bottles as steadily as he held boardroom meetings. Grandma Ruth began to trust him in small, stubborn increments, like lending a book and waiting to see if it returned. And Ella, sweet and fierce, finally started calling this place our home. A key can lock a door, but it can also open one. I spent years trapped behind the wrong doors, thinking I deserved nothing better. Then I chose a different doorway, and I kept choosing it every day. If this story moved you, please like, share, and comment. Tell me about a time you chose yourself or your family even when you were scared.